I'm David Furlong, handle DF on Farcaster. My background, I studied computer science and philosophy and did a lot of building for the web during my studies and after them. And then I decided I wanted a career where I had both impact and where I could sort of develop my skills. And I chose to start a company out of university. And we built a volunteering marketplace with a SaaS attached to it, a very Web2 business. And that sort of went reasonably well. And I was sort of in a place where it felt like the web wasn't really improving that much. It felt like a lot of the challenges we had as a company and sort of builders in general felt like there was this sort of meta problem of the web, which was sort of that creating network effects around products was really the hard thing, and the product was in many ways less and less difficult to create. And so it felt like the web was becoming a place where you had these sort of market networks or platforms that were starting to dominate things. And it felt like as a builder, I couldn't build the things I wanted to because it was extremely difficult and very capital intensive to get the network effects to do so. And it feels like this has been a trend that's sort of been growing. And so, you know, when you think about these things and what can actually disrupt it, is sort of Web3 was the thing where it's like this is the technology that can actually change the incentives around the web. So that's sort of how I got into Web3. Um, and I think or back then when I was thinking about it, I thought sort of consumer apps where you can sort of have a have a direct line to the user would be the most likely way that sort of we'd see a shift in the way the internet works. And as a result, I sort of was looking at what were the sort of consumer facing or social technologies in crypto. And Farcaster, I came across it. I was doing On Deck. It's sort of like a founders program, and someone in my cohort recommended Farcaster to me. And then I started building up Farcaster, and yeah, built a couple of things sort of as experiments. People seemed to like it. It was one of the first places where it felt like you could build something, and if it was good, then you would immediately get quality users giving you feedback on it. Which I didn't have a big distribution on Twitter at that time, and one of the things that I think is really difficult as a builder is if you're pre-distribution, if you haven't really built enough distribution on any accounts, it just becomes extremely difficult to launch products because you're sort of starting from zero. You get no feedback, you get no initial sort of spark, and it becomes very difficult to build things. And so part of the other reason of sort of building in social was like I almost feel like that's like the first thing builders should build before even building a product is you need some distribution. Um, so I started building a Farcast client called Disco. Um, it was different from Warpcast in that people could sort of program their own feeds and share them and fork them. And then we also experimented with mini apps. And then we did A16Z's crypto startup school in LA at the beginning of last year. And during that time, Farcaster was, pre-protocol in many ways, in that, the data wasn't on hubs, it was all Warpcast APIs. And we were sort of figuring out, what what can we do that's still sort of venture scalable, but in a situation where maybe there won't be much growth for the next couple months. And so we essentially decided to focus on this sort of question of like how can Web3 social be better than sort of Web2 social? And I think there's a couple ways that can happen. One of the big ones that we took a bet on was like mini apps. Mini apps seem to be, uniquely enabled by Web3, and there's a lot more sort of tailwinds around composability. And so we started working on sort of a protocol for mini apps, starting with Farcaster support. It was called Mod. We built a bunch of open source stuff around it. We got it integrated into a couple clients. We tried to get Warpcast on board with it, and Warpcast decided to do their own thing with frames, which was sort of solving a similar problem, a similar time, and at that point we were kind of in an awkward position where we didn't have the distribution. Warpcast had the distribution, and so we pivoted to building um, Frames.js, which is a library for making frames. And then we also started working on OpenFrames, which is a sort of standard for frames that work across many ecosystems, not just Farcaster. Um, and what else? Yeah, there's a lot to my Farcaster building story. Um, I mean, there's a bunch of things in there that I probably missed. Then earlier this year, we started working on an app that was frames focused as well. Um, Part of the reason behind that was sort of getting your own distribution, and not being always in the hands of, other platforms or other apps. And then most recently, last 2 weeks, we launched Larry, which is a bot for Farcaster that lets people launch tokens. The tokens sort of work similar to the way party protocol tokens work. So anybody can sort of create a sort of round, and then it runs for 69 minutes, and anyone with a sort of sufficiently high civil score can join that round, and then it sort of launches a token. And the idea behind Larry was, we've been building an app for a long, long time. We hadn't shipped it partially because we had this whole plan around the network effects of the app. And then we felt like we hadn't been shipping anything for a long time. And when that happens, the I guess like the energy in the team changes. And so it was kind of we need to ship something just to build momentum and sort of feel alive as builders again. Uh, Two, like there is a massive opportunity right now. I think we saw in the data that there was a huge amount of and still is a huge amount of interest in sort of playing around with agents and tokens on Farcaster. And three, like I think what we've been trying to figure out is like, how do we start this flywheel of like people building great mini apps, users using them, the people who created them or are sort of building them getting some sort of value out of it, and therefore them reinvesting in building more great mini apps. And sort of that flywheel is something we've been trying to figure out. And I think maybe tokens are one way of sort of starting that flywheel around builders. Anyway, that was a very, very long-winded explanation of everything we've been up to. But yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. No, I appreciate it. And yeah, so I got a bunch of questions, but first, is this you mentioned like sort of the team, just kind of wanting to ship something. It had been a while. Is this the same team that is doing like Larry that previously did um frames.js that also worked on open frames? Like, is this one team that's sort of carried through with all of these things? And how many people are there actually like on the team that you're talking about?
Yeah, it is the same team. So there's four of us. We're all engineers. So some of us are more recent, sort of more recently joined. Um, the we are still working on the app. So Larry is sort of an experiment, and we've always said it's an experiment. We're not going to discontinue it. it's working fairly well. So it is an avenue for us to explore the monetization angle of sort of how do we sort of get builders funded. Um, and so that's sort of the direction we're going with it. Um, and yeah, so right now, me and Stefan are working on Larry, and we have been for the last couple of weeks. And then the other two people on the team are working on our app, and we also have like a developer product as part of the app that we're launching as part of that.
So I might have missed this or might be misunderstanding like sort of the reference, but what is the actual app that you're working on, or is that something you're not saying at this point?
Sure. No, I can talk about it. So the app's called Frames.fun. We've been working on it for a while. It is, let's see, it's a bit like Zora, but for frames. So, you know, I don't know if you've used the Zora app, but you can sort of onboard without a crypto wallet, without knowing anything about crypto. Uh, when you sort of open the app for the first time, you see a bunch of sort of frames or mini apps that you can play with. And then there
This
is an
is
embedded wallet.
this is frames.fun you're talking about. Zora, you see a bunch of like
Yeah,
images or videos, and with
yeah,
this,
yeah.
instead of
Sorry,
images or videos, you're
yeah,
seeing a bunch of like mini apps basically. It's
yeah,
almost like a mini what was that site called? Addictive Games or whatever when I was like a kid. Like you got a bunch of these like sort of mini games or mini apps basically, and they're organized in a feed similarly to Zora or something like that. Is that right?
yeah, yeah. A little bit like that. I guess another way to see it is like anytime you open a wallet app, like a crypto wallet, I think like the homepage should be like, what can you do with your crypto, right? Like it's like the homepage of your wallet. And
Right.
so kind of what we're building is kind of that. It's like, mini apps, I believe are like the best experience for using crypto. And so, if like what would the homepage for that look like, right? And so, with Frames of Fun, you open it and you have your sort of saved frames. You have like explore feeds of like art or games or other things. And so, there's some element of like social personalization, there's some element of like algorithmic recommendations, and there's a lot of just like how can we make using and playing on chain as easy as possible for the average consumer. So
Right.
there's no sort of, and so there is an embedded wallet, and we have a sort of like Spark system where it is like one tap to like pay or mint. um, and so that's sort of something we've been building for a while. And then there's a second part to the app, where we have um, a sort of uh, a permission system in frames that we've built out that sort of enables new capabilities for frames and mini apps. So um, I think one of the things there's some things you can do with frames today, like you can like open a link, you can in Warpcast you can like open a transaction or you can start a mint. um, so we've been exploring how can we expand on those capabilities so that developers can do richer things with just one tap. So um, that's the second part of the app we've been working on. The somewhat problematic part of the app is that Warpcast has made it clear that they want to kill Frames V1. Um, and so we're kind of in an awkward position where we've spent a lot of time and a lot of resources building on top of Frames V1. And so yeah, we're kind of trying to make sure it doesn't die. But Warpcast seems to be pretty set on Frames V2, which I think the name already reveals that like they both can't survive. Like Frames V2, Frames V1 are not human friendly names.
Right. So when when you're talking about like V1 versus V2, like you've been talking a lot about mini apps. I'm actually not really sure the difference between what was previously announced as like mini apps on Warpcast and now like Frames V2. They both seem to be like you open up a pretty, full experience of whatever you can do with the
It,
thing
they,
versus
they they
Frames.
are the
Yeah.
same thing.
Right.
They
Okay.
are
So
the same. Basically,
yeah,
they renamed them. They originally called them app frames or mini apps, and then they decided to just call them frames.
right. So given that you're sort of trying to build this feed like it would be um, a separate app or separate feed from Warpcast, does it really matter that like what does it matter if Warpcast continues to put an emphasis on V1 frames or moves towards mini apps? That's sort of one question. And then the other is like, given that you want to enable these richer experiences, are mini apps or V2 frames, whatever you want to call it, not a more like interesting thing to build off of than the V1 frames where it's like, limited to, four buttons and like fairly limited actions and things like that? Like, would you not want to build on this sort of like higher functionality, or is there something about like the frames V1 that makes it better for what you're building?
Yeah, no, very good questions. So the first question um, um, regarding, if Warpcast discontinues them, it, I think we've seen because Warpcast has said they're not going to support Frames V1, or I mean, I think they've left it somewhat ambiguous, but I think the writing's sort of on the wall. Um, the result is that developers are not maintaining or investing in building Frames V1 frames. And the reality with the app, and part of what we are trying to figure out was like there are not enough compelling new experiences being built on Frames V1 frames. I think part of like as a result of that, I think Warpcast was like, okay, like these things are kind of hard to build, and it's kind of hard to build them well, and people aren't building that many of them anymore. So that's, I think, part of their reasoning for killing them. I think the number one sort of tailwind that's going to totally change this is AIs um, creating frames and mini apps. And so uh, part of the whole bet behind us building the app was like, we are going to let people create these things in, a couple clicks and just through a natural language interface. And so they're going to be able to create crypto mini apps with, embedded social financial rails and distribute them. Um, and without that, I don't think the app makes sense because there's not enough good content. And it's really, time intensive to build that great content, and you haven't been able to monetize it that well. And so it didn't really make sense for a lot of people to build these things. But I think that's going to change. And the reason, yeah, so Warpcast, all the network effects are around that. So if people stop building them, then and you can't get the distribution on Warpcast, you can still do it, but you can't really use Farcaster as like the initial bootstrapping of the network effects. Um, the second question around Frames V2 versus Frames V1. So Frames V2 is like full Telegram mini apps, sort of fully expressive apps. I, I don't think these are actually alternatives to each other. So um, I think the Frames V2 is a bit more similar to something like an embedded browser.
Yeah.
If you open Rainbow and you go to the browser, and you go to a crypto website, it's like that, but it's like a couple steps better. Um, and that's nice. And like wallet flow has been broken.
Why
Um,
why is it a couple steps better?
because um, with like a Rainbow embedded browser wallet, you still have to connect. And the way you connect is a bit clunky. And with and there are ways to sort of connect automatically,
Right.
but I think the norms aren't quite there. Whereas with Warpcast or Frames V2, you basically as a user have a guarantee that you will automatically be logged in. Um, so that immediately is just a better experience.
Right.
And then there's a couple other APIs that you know now there's like one or two APIs, but I think this will mature. So um, the essentially the frictionlessness will improve. Um,
Yeah, and it
but
seems
the
pretty obvious like that it's not ideal when you're within Rainbow browser or Coinbase Wallet browser or whatever it might be. It seems pretty obvious that ideally you would just be automatically connected on any website that you go to versus the current, which,
yeah
like you're saying, you have to kind of clunkily connect on each one. It should be the way that it is within the mini apps on Farcaster currently, where it's automatically connected when you go to one of these mini apps.
Yeah, I mean it's not quite that easy because I mean as soon as you connect you're like revealing your identity, right? So if you wanted to be private you would have lost that privacy, right?
Right.
So there definitely are some like reasons why wallets can't immediately do this, because it's kind of not the product norm to do that, and it changes some of the assumptions for the user. Um, but yeah, I mean, Warpcast is going to have an embedded wallet. Like, that's the next sort of frictionless step. And like, Warpcast is increasingly going to look like a wallet, right? I think
Or
that much is
or a
inevitable.
browser. Or a browser, basically, like some combination of the two, but like the hub where you do everything that you do in crypto.
Yeah, I would say it's not going to look like a browser, because a browser is very much like you can go to all the websites. I think part of Warpcast's power is like you guarantee a user experience that is like very high, and then you get everybody else to integrate with you into your sort of proprietary, Farcaster identity system, and
Right.
that sort of builds your moat and locks people in, and it at the same time elevates the crypto UX, right? So I think it is like a net good thing that like crypto UX does need to improve, and maybe this is the way to do it. But like I don't think there will be a version where like you can go to other websites. Like I
Right.
don't think it's like full browser.
A
Anyway,
limited
the
browser,
reason,
a limited browser, basically like a curated browser.
yeah, I think so Frames V1 and Frames V2 are kind of different in the sense that Frames V1 was interesting because um, one of the sort of things about the internet that kind of sucks is like you go to a website and you can basically only interact with stuff from that website, and then you go to another website and you can like only interact with stuff from that website, and then in very very limited cases there is a way for like you to interact with another website, uh, on another website. So like, maybe in Notion or something, there's like a Figma embed or something, and then you can press on like this little stuff inside this little frame, and then something happens on a Figma document somewhere else. Or like
Right.
maybe Slack like integrates, your like uh, task management tool, and you can like do something, but it's very clunky to sort of get different websites to sort of be able to interact with each other. And Frames V1 was very interesting because you could basically, as a website, have a way to communicate how another interface could interact with it. And so, it allowed things like, you can RSVP to an event from Warpcast or from Supercast or from, our app or anywhere in a sort of permissionless way that's sort of uh, um, secured and sort of verifiably signed. And Frames V2 doesn't do that at all, right? It really is just like every website is its own sort of domain again, and there's no sort of cross frame interaction possible. And so I kind of think Frames V2 is kind of missing something that uh, the thing that made Frames V1 special. And I have a version of this that I've been suggesting in the spec that sort of brings frames v1 in a version to frames v2. Um, and I mean, I'm somewhat selfishly motivated because we have been building some cool stuff that would use this. Um, and I would love to see it happen. But I also think it's like the best version of like this like composable Legos sort of thing that's happening on Farcaster, because it's kind of a weird position where like um, Warpcast is kind of like a platform, and it kind of has incentives that are slightly different from if you're another client, or if you're just like fully Farcaster aligned, and so there are things where it's like, oh, like if you enabled like something like frames v1 again inside frames v2, it would enable things like a third party wallet even if the client didn't allow for it, right? So you could pay with pay with a button press instead of using the native apps wallet.
Right. So what is you mentioned like the sort of proposal for bringing the V1 frames forward into like the V2. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like that future that you would like to see rather than the quote unquote like killing of the V1 in favor of the V2?
Yeah. Yeah. So the frames v1 had a couple of problems. I'd say the biggest one was, or the biggest two, one is like expressivity, right? Apps can do very, very little with four buttons and an image and an input. The
Right.
second big problem was performance. Basically, because apps had to generate this image dynamically for the most part, it kind of made them pretty slow. And because, apps want to preserve privacy with frames, a lot of the frames took a couple seconds, and that's just like not acceptable. Um, and so my proposal basically is um, uh, in Frames v2, or frames can basically call this like SDK Actions API. So they can do things like start a transaction. And when they do that, sort of the app they're in, for example, Warpcast, will show us sort of transactions screen, and then the user can approve or reject a transaction. Um, and so I think there's an opportunity for something similar, except instead of starting a transaction, you can open a frames v1 frame. And there's an additional sort of clause that this frames v1 frame can't sort of do all the things frames v1 frames can do today, but it's basically limited to sort of one screen. And so you can sort of limit the performance implications, um, and it can still act as this sort of permissions dialogue. Because if you see sort of like Warpcast or Farcaster as a sort of operating system, then um, what things can an operating system do? Well, the operating system is kind of responsible for sort of safeguarding the user's sort of capabilities and data. So, like, an app wants to access your notifications, or an app wants to access your photos, or an app wants to sort of change something about your device. And so, I think sort of Warpcast is similar to that. You sort of bring your data, and then the frame is sort of requesting permission to certain parts of it. And I think right now it's kind of like the sort of operating system model, where it's like the operating system sort of defines, you know, these are the three things you can access, or whatever many. But it gets really interesting when it's not just the operating system being able to define, hey, I have photos, notifications, whatever, but it's actually all the apps on the internet, right? And now it's like, oh, like Events XYZ has like an event that you can, RSVP to. And that's now like a permission that another website can pull up. So, for example, if I had a website, I could say like RSVP to the thing, to my event, and it would pull up a events XYZ frame, I'd say yes. That would send my sort of signed yes to the events XYZ website. That server would basically sign me up. Now I'm getting events XYZ notifications, and I've never actually gone to events.xyz, right? Entirely permissionless sort of composition. You can do this with, paragraph subscriptions. You can do it with all sorts of things. But I think that's really the sort of like many to many sort of composability future of crypto, rather than this like, Warpcast defines 5 permissions that its wallet and its app can do, and those are the sort of 5 things that frames can do.
And do you need frames like in the middle, like V1 frames in the middle of that, or can, whatever website that's like crypto website that's having an event that says you can sign up with Eventcaster, and in your example, you launch the frame and sign up through the V1 frame within like the V2 frame or the mini app.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why that should be the frame, the V1 frame, versus just that website just choosing to sort of like integrate with Eventcaster directly?
Yeah. So the the sort of role of Warpcast in frames is like Warpcast is the only app typically that has your signer. So the frame doesn't have your Farcaster signer. So it can't sign messages on behalf of the user. And in many ways, like frames are kind of an untrusted environment, right? So especially in frames v2, like, people can make a frame that is, trying to fish for user credentials or is like malicious in some way. And so it's sort of Warpcast's job in some way, or the client's job, to when there is an action that needs, third party verification, to enable the, the collecting of that sort of signature of that action from the user. And so in frames v1, that's kind of what happened, is like, if if I have a frame and I get a sort of signed message that the user pressed this button, I know that a an app that has access to the user signer created that. And so without that app doing that, sure, I can one-to-one integrate with events XYZ, but then events XYZ needs to trust me. And I'm potentially just like a permissionless builder that's a non, that doesn't have distribution, doesn't have relationships to them, right? And so that's sort of, now you sort of make it permissioned, right? Or you need to redirect the user from your app to events XYZ for them to do something. And that's, I think, just a worse experience, right? That's the sort of the version of the web where like each website, each domain has its boundaries, and like there's very little interaction between them.
Right. Can you like, given the sort of what sounds to be somewhat of like a limbo status of frames.fun, like what happens if you just ship it and like frame I think it's fair to say right now, whether or not Warpcast has plans to kill Frames V1, right now Frames V1 still are a thing, and I would say Frames V2 are still like very early. They certainly haven't caught like Frames V1 did. I see them once in a while, but I still see Frames V1 much more popularly. Everyone understands Frames V1. So if you launched Frames.fun catering to the Frames V1 and people liked it, then couldn't that like either, potentially change Warpcast's view to either keep Frames V1 in some sense, or re-implement Frames V1 in the way that you're suggesting, sort of combined with Frames V2, or being useful alongside Frames V2 and within Frames V2. And then secondarily, if it didn't change their mind, I'm sort of going along with this assumption. I have no knowledge that they're going to kill Frames V1, but I'm just sort of going along with what you've been saying, then like even if they don't change their mind on that, couldn't people, if Frames V1 are genuinely, very interesting and useful in certain ways, and Frames.fun allows people to create them much more easily, natural language text and everything that you were mentioning earlier, couldn't then that still be advantageous in that people might choose to stick around with Frames.fun and even spend more time there if Warpcast does in fact, uh, you know, not support Frames V1 anymore, and people sort of miss that Frames V1 experience, which has suddenly sort of gotten an upgrade through Frames.fun? Like, is that something you're thinking about, or do you view yourself as more Warpcast dependent, that you really need to see what they're going to do, and you can't sort of try to double down on Frames V1 if in fact Warpcast is going to sort of move away from it?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I mean, we've been trying to make ourselves more independent of not being susceptible uh to like if Warpcast changes their minds about things, then we're in an awkward position. But sort of here we are to some degree. Um, the reality is something like Frames V1 is very network effects driven, right? You need you need users on one side and sort of developers on the other side. And ideally developers with existing apps that are already being sort of shared and used, where they have some sort of proprietary data access. Um, and so I think we can do it. We just won't have the network effects that, Farcaster and Warpcast has right now, right? And so it's a lot of work to build it up. And of course you can go with what's already there now. Um, but the yeah, I mean I think the state of crypto is still fairly small. So, you know, we ideally want to be aligned with sort of Farcaster's growth and betting on Farcaster as an ecosystem. And if Farcaster as an ecosystem is going with a different technology, then it makes it a bit harder. Um, we are we are integrating both Frames V2 and Frames V1, and I think we will have a shot at trying to convince people, including the Warpcast team, that there is value in keeping Frames V1 around um, in a certain shape. Um, but yeah, I mean it's um it's tricky because yeah, there's obviously like it's a lot of work to convince developers to support and build something if you don't have sufficient distribution, right? And Warpcast is the only client on Farcaster that has any sort of meaningful distribution today.
Yeah, I just feel like it sounds like you've built something pretty cool and interesting, and I would hate to see it like not see the light just because it's sort of like the timing is wrong, especially during this
Yeah,
window where it still seems like Frames V1 are. I understand like completely. Warpcast is definitely seemingly actively trying to build momentum around V2. I think there's lots of interesting things about Frames V2, previously called mini apps. They're just more, despite the things that it doesn't have from Frames V1 that you've talked about, like independent of that, it's more of a familiar Web 2 experience, and that's not the goal. But like that, basically, there's pros and cons of Web 2 experiences versus, let's say, Frames V1. The pro is that it's just like a much better experience. You're not waiting seconds between loads. It's not just images and four buttons. Like it's a full experience that people are accustomed to. The cons are that you're sort of moving away from this ability to interoperate with all these other apps, like you mentioned. And so, um, like those are genuine, I think, pros and cons. And so, I like the mini apps and the V2 for the pros, but I also sympathize with the cons and the things that were cool about Frames V1. And so, as Warpcast is transitioning towards the V2, I feel like there's still a window here to the extent that you do have something that is like pretty shippable. I mean, I don't know, just me personally, like I would love to try it out. And I understand there's also like sort of a risk. You ship something you've been working on for a long time, doesn't go as planned,
yeah,
and then like, you have to figure out what to do next. But I feel like if you envision that you might have to sort of pivot anyway because of this transition to the V2, like it would be cool to at least let the V1 thing see the light. Like I know, being able to launch a frame
Yeah.
V1 with the
I mean,
natural
we
language.
we we
Yeah,
we are still building it.
yeah,
We are still building the app. I think the reality is that like right now people aren't building Frames V2 either, right? I think the builder energy very much is like around agents and bots, and in part because A, it's the new thing, right? And B, like the monetization for builders is just way better than Frames, right? and and that's as a result of tokens. And so I think part of why we built Larry and part of what we've been trying to figure out is like how do we actually align incentives here where if you build something valuable, there is a business model that will reward you sufficiently,
right.
and sort of the best builders will compete to build compelling app experiences that are sort of mini apps. And so that's part of it. I think the second part, we will launch the app. I think the second part really is an observation that um, the people in our space make very quick decisions around apps, in large part around whether an app will make them money or not. And so I feel as though launching an app when you don't have sufficient conviction in the distribution and the interest right at that moment, it is sort of a losing proposition because you're I think your first week is like really when people will form an opinion. And even if you ship the best thing, a month later, I think it's sort of contrary to a lot of advice, um, which is like launch early and like do everything in public and like iterate and like
Right.
I think for a lot of things that makes sense. There are exceptions, and I think in our case, there are a couple things around what we're trying to do with sort of network effects that mean we really want to get it right when we do launch. And
What do
the
you
the interest right now is not there in the market.
what do you think differentiates, like roughly speaking, or as best you can, like what do you think differentiates products for which, you know, launch fast and then iterate in public or over time is good advice versus what you're talking about here, where it sounds like you view that as bad advice. Do you have like, is there something that is fundamentally different between products where that's good or bad advice, or is it just sort of like a case by case thing? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's very dangerous thinking you're an exception to any rule, and generally not advisable. Um, and not launching for a while has a lot of downsides.
I'll I'll also add one sort of supporting point from my perspective that potentially to support the argument that launch fast and iterate over time is not the move. In what case is it the move? In what case is it not? I'll give one piece of support for the idea that it's a category in which it's not, which is actually just crypto as a whole, pretty much. And I'm not saying this is true or that I believe this, but I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that crypto, the way that you configure things, like sort of at the contract level, with making a certain number of like sort of irreversible decisions um, at launch, makes it less, uh, less what's the right word? Like it's harder to iterate over time. There are more front-loaded, irreversible decisions than with launching a random,
For
Web2
sure, for
consumer app.
sure.
So I
I
think
mean,
that
I mean, we
generally,
had this.
yeah, yeah,
We had this with Larry, right? The first token we created with Larry was the Larry token, and yeah, we've learned a lot since that token. I would love to have another go at it, but you don't really get that when you have to use your own token launcher in a sort of defensive manner.
Yeah,
Um,
you have to
yeah,
go and create Barry if you want to redo.
yeah, no, I think all the people holding Larry would hate me, so I don't think that's an option either. Um, so there's a couple ones, right? Like one is like if you have a sufficiently compelling idea in crypto and you do it in an iterative manner, the financial incentives being so strong in this space, like someone with better distribution, with faster execution, will probably fast follow and maybe beat you. Um, I don't think that's the case in our case. The second reason maybe not to do this sort of fast launch is if you feel like um, you're able to you're trying to build network effects right off the get-go. So you there are certain things where you need sufficient liquidity on launch day, right? So for example, if you work at Uber and you're launching a new city, you don't iterative launch with like 3 drivers and 5 users on day one, right? You make sure you have like 100 drivers and you work on building those first, and then you work on ad campaigns to get enough distribution, and then like on a certain day you hit live and you have enough liquidity on both sides of the marketplace. So in those cases you don't sort of launch on day one. You realize that like you need to make sure you hit network liquidity, and
Right.
so um that I think that's to some degree what's been delaying us a little bit with what we're trying to do. There are very strong network effects to the sort of permission system thing that I was describing, and so we we realize that if it you don't have a second go at that, right? You're trying to build a sort of developer ecosystem, and you kind of need enough users in it at the same time. um, and so I think that's another compelling reason to sort of not iterate. um, and then the third one I think is if you are not sufficiently convinced of the direction. I think as soon as you launch, you're going to be like bogged down with like bug reports, feedback, users telling you things, and like that is very valuable um in like sensing a direction from where you are. It's sort of like a local navigation,
Right.
gives you a lot of data. But if you're still making decisions around big picture stuff, you're kind of you're going to be in a position where you're like, oh, now I need to sprint. I need to keep improving the product. I need to talk to users and like make sure everyone's happy, and really spend a lot of resources on like keeping the fire alive versus making sure that you have enough capacity to like figure out these big, important, difficult problems. And maybe that's a question of just like having more resources, or being more resourceful with what you have. But it definitely is a trade-off where you lose some flexibility by launching.
Yeah, that's a really organized answer, more so than I would have expected, it just being asked sort of like on the fly. But those are three, I think, sensible reasons in addition to the one that I brought up around just crypto in general, maybe being a little bit more, um, for what it's worth. I think the first one is somewhat, well, those are all, I guess, applicable beyond crypto. The first one maybe is the most debatable from my perspective in that, this concern of like a fast follow and someone doing it better. I'm always skeptical of this idea that like someone's going to steal your idea and do it better. I mean, I understand like it does happen in certain situations, but I feel like the execution is the idea to a large degree. And so like someone can't just like take the basic idea and do it better. Like I feel like the idea is much
Yeah, no,
more than just
I
like the
agree.
seed. So anyway, I'm a little skeptical on that one, but in general, as a the three reasons you gave, plus the fact that crypto is tends to be more irreversible based on how you launch than than, Web 2 stuff. I think the combined of those, 3 or 4 reasons is like there's certainly cases in which it might make sense to, launch fast and iterate. And there's certainly cases in which it's not. And I think, either argument can be reasonable depending on the situation. That's a good framework for thinking about it, I think, that you gave. So, um, with that, Larry seems to have been on the other side of the equation where you guys seem to have built and launched quite fast. And my understanding is like sort of the obvious comp is Clanker, which was kind of the first notable successful token launcher on Farcaster. Maybe you could argue Base as a whole that um, became pretty popular with Anon and Clanker token itself, and I think Lum before that, and now there's several others. And my understanding of like sort of the core differentiator between Larry versus Clanker is, and there's been others since then as well, is it seems like Larry tried to solve the problem where you launch a Clanker and it's overwhelmed by bots and snipers, and sort of the price goes up quick, price goes down quick, and it's kind of hard to know, like as a regular person interested in the project, when to get involved, and like to get involved at a reasonable price, not like sort of on the upswing with the bots and the snipers that you're going to get rugged by them and whatnot. And so it seems like Larry tried to solve that by saying, hey, this doesn't launch right away. There's this sort of, you know, opening period, 69 minutes, I think you said, that anyone can get involved, and everyone gets involved at like the same price. And that seems like it might be uh, sufficient defense against this sort of like bots and snipers problem. Is that in fact like what, the core differentiator? Are there other core differentiators? And not to
Yeah.
like overwhelm with questions, but has that, if that's the case, has that strategy sort of worked for the purpose intended, regardless of, the how
Yeah.
Larry has done overall? Did that mechanism solve the problem you were trying to solve?
Yeah, so that's an accurate description. That is the main differentiator. And it is the reason why we built Larry to begin with, right? I trade, you know, I use crypto, I trade, my friends trade. And at some point it wasn't getting fun anymore because the snipers were buying, 10% of supply for one ETH. It's superhuman speed. Um, Even in the same block because of the way things work. And so, um, there was this sentiment from the Clanker founders that like snipers are users too, and that that snipers are kind of fine in the sense that they're users too. And I mean, I think like they validated that there is a huge market here, and like as builders on top of Farcaster, we've been building for a long time with very little market anywhere, right? So the fact that a huge amount of users were interested in sort of token launches and experimenting with them, and B that they had a revenue model that actually made it a viable business, and C the fact that it's a nascent technology with a lot of big problems, and unsolved problems that we had a different perspective on. And so, yeah, we made Larry because we believe that snipers aren't users too. They're not your friends. Like these are very sophisticated professionals that are sort of making a lot of money off of you and your friends, and there should be a better way. And so, the party model was part of the inspiration, and part of it was just like
Party
how
as in
how
like
do you
the John Palmer app?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and part of it is just like, okay, well, snipers win by being like superhuman fast. What if we make like speed at the beginning not matter, right?
Right.
And so that was kind of the Larry approach. We start off with 15 minutes, and a minimum of 3 ETH raised. We learned that like 15 minutes is very short. It's
And
it's good in that it creates.
if it doesn't raise the 3 ETH in 15 minutes, or with this V1, if it didn't raise the 3 ETH in 15 minutes,
Yeah,
it just like doesn't launch the token. Everyone gets their money back.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how it worked. And and what we learned from talking to users was like people without big followings just couldn't fund the 3 even if they had a great meme, like 15 minutes wasn't long enough. They didn't have enough distribution. And so, you could make it like a day, but then it kills all urgency. And then it's like, why would I buy in it after 10 minutes if I can wait 24 hours and have more information? So you start to get all sorts of other sort of weird game theory if you wait too long. And so in many ways, 15 minutes, now it's 69 minutes, is sort of like a, reasonable, like short time window where there's still urgency and it's still kind of like a new token that's launched and you kind of all get the same price. The other opinionated stance we took was basically only users with a sufficiently high sort of NANAR score could participate in the rounds, and they could only participate a certain amount. So it's 0.25 ETH. The idea here is like, you know, it's all good that you have sniper protection, but because everyone's getting the same price, if you have one whale sniper that just buys into a round for 5 ETH or whatever, all of a sudden they hold a huge amount of the supply again, and you're kind of at the mercy of them. And so they could be entirely anonymous. They could have 10 wallets buying it. And so in many ways, like
Oh,
I
that's why
think
you need the
the
Nanar. I was wondering the two things didn't seem to go
yeah
hand in hand, but you need the Nanar so that you can't have the whale get a bunch of accounts and sort of get around the max.
exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. And so the second way in which we're differentiated from Clanker right now is we give the creator 60% of the LP fees, and we take 40, and Clanker does the reverse. Um, and those are the two big ones. I mean, we're iterating and experimenting with things, and like the reality is like we launched when the market was already coming down, and like nothing good happens in crypto markets when like you're past peak,
Yeah.
and I think we launched past peak on like token launches on Farcaster, which is fine, but the network effects are very strong, and we've had a lot of tokens launch on Larry. The I think the real test is like, uh, do people who launch on Larry get fair entries? And what we found is like yes, like they they get to buy cheaper and before snipers, and the snipers are actually buying after, and as a user you could dump on the sniper. So that's a nice sort of like that part is working. The part that we're still trying to figure out is like the choice of token launcher is not based on sniper protection, right? It's very mimetic. It's like, oh, uh, everybody's using this, so I use this, and we
Okay.
do this with a lot of technologies. And so the default is very powerful, and it's not about technology or anything like that. The second one is just distribution, right? So distribution matters, and so we're sort of trying to figure that out. And there's sort of two viable directions for I think token launchers. Is like one, it's like purely a tool. It's kind of like Stripe, or sort of like a credit card checkout. The user is just like using the tool and you take a tiny fee. Or on the other end is like the token launcher actually helps with distribution and like finding that initial community, bootstrapping the initial network effects. And that's where, you can charge a much higher fee. And that's sort of where sort of Clanker and Larry and sort of a lot of token launches are trying to be, because that's where it isn't a race to the bottom, right? That's where you have some differentiation. Um, I think the biggest thing we've been trying to figure out with Larry though is like I think there's two opposing directions that are sort of happening. One is like you sort of want a guaranteed stamp of a fair token launch. So as a user buying a token, if you can see, right now is created on Pumped Up Fund, you kind of have this stamp that like, yes, this token was fairly launched. There's no like insiders that are, you know, gave themselves allocation and are now ready to like dump on you, right?
Right.
And so that's extremely powerful, and I think that's what Pump Fund did. And what that means is like you can't let any token launch that is not fair, right? And that means you can't have whitelist, you can't have invite only, you can't have any of these things, right? And those are a lot of things people have been asking us for. The other side of what's happening is like ICOs, right? ICOs are back. Echo's doing huge volume, and so there's this direction of token launches ICO, and that's very different, right? There is an insider allocation to some degree. There is like whitelist. There is like, I want to reward my community, and I want to, only let them participate to some degree. And some of the sort of Farcaster tokens, there was a whole meta of launching to a channel or points based on a channel, like Degen initially, right? And having like inflationary tokens, right, where Degen inflates, as far as I know, a small percentage each year, where you can just give out the token. And so, those are not quote unquote fair launch total meme coins, right? There's a lot more sophistication going on there. But a lot of those things also start to look like securities a little bit. And so that those are sort of the two polar directions that token launchers can kind of go. One is like guaranteed fair. The other is like ICO style full configurability. Um, and a lot of the top coins. If you look at the top coins on Clanker, I think 5 of the top 10 when I last checked were apps, right? So Clanker, Native, um,
Anon.
Clank Fun, Anon, right? And and that's a really interesting thing where it's like, okay, like these things are starting to look a bit like ICOs, and it's clear that the market values apps more than pure memes or jokes to some degree right now.
Well,
At least
on Clanker,
in our ecosystem.
yeah, on Clanker at least, which is sort of on, you know, I think of Farcaster as like sort of a circle within the larger circle of base. Like last I checked, like 90% of on-chain activity by people on Farcaster is, or at least their connected wallets is on base. So maybe that doesn't include like Solana activity, but within Ethereum ecosystem. So at least, and then Clanker is sort of the subcircle that is mostly overlapping with Farcaster. Also, some of that's going to be outside of Farcaster on base, but all of it is within base. And so within those, like, the intersection of Clanker, Farcaster, and base, at the very least, apps seem to be valued more highly. But then in a separate ecosystem like on Solana, that doesn't really seem to be the case, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, for certainly, like this is very much a Farcaster phenomenon. Um, but I suppose what that's sort of telling me is that like people value fair launches, but also um, like coins are a great way for apps to monetize or get attention,
Yeah.
right? And like one of the biggest missed opportunities I think is like apps that needs network effects not having ownership by the community to some degree, right? Like I think that is one of the trends that will be massive. And this is kind of a way to do it without going through all the securities sort of regulation in the US, but it does seem to be sort of uh, pushing up against the boundary of what might be a security. And so I think that's kind of the challenge right now is like, how do you keep it fair, but also allow this like, you know, to get the right people on board that are going to be your true believers that are going to be supporting you where, you know, there are, there are right now, if you have fair launches, it also means your people who hate you can buy lots of the token right at the beginning and then can mess with you later on, right? And so it's kind of a weird tension right now where it's a nascent technology. I think it's great that lots of people are experimenting with it. I think there's still a lot of like improvements to be made. And I think apps will and token launchers will diverge, right? We, they're, I think Clanker is going in the direction of pumped up fun. I think, for base, I think we're more likely to go in a direction of like, um, how do we, um, how do we fund
closer to the
builders?
ICO.
Yeah. I mean, we need to figure out how to do it in a reasonable way that's not a security. Um,
Right.
but um, but yeah, I don't think you can do both really well, right?
Well, I
Because
think
as soon
people
as you
probably,
allow,
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
well, as soon as you allow like whitelist configurability, you're going to get some amount of people abusing it to sort of cabal pump and dump. Um, and then you lose your stamp of like fair launches. So I don't think you can go both directions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like part of the reason, you might be getting, like users might be pushing Larry in that direction because it sort of launched with just like even the smallest hint of like it takes one step towards that direction from where Clanker is, in that it has this period of time in which everyone, gets involved sort of as like a team, even though it's not like an existing team or like a group of app users. There's this element of like you join this early group, and then so like falling out from just that one little sort of like tease in that direction, people are like, oh, maybe this should go like, can this go all the way in that other direction and have it be, whitelist and everything like that, just by offering like a small hint at that. I feel like maybe, that people are, asking for that because of just this
Yeah,
small, very small difference in the way that you launch, which was still much more so on the like fair launch side of things. But just because there was one little step in the other direction, people are like, oh, can we continue to go in that direction? The other thing I wanted to sort of this term occurred to me as you were speaking, and I want to just sort of like say it out loud so I don't forget it. But and maybe it's not that good, but it's kind of interesting, I think, which is that um, on Solana you see like these, at least as far as I see, like there's a lot of the obviously the meme coin space has been like sort of bigger over there, and the ones that do well seem to be more so like pure memes, not like with an app attached, like an Anon or a Clank Fun or a Clanker or the others you mentioned earlier. And base seems to be much more like, it's ridiculous what percentage of people on Farcaster, for example, are like building things within crypto. Like it's such a strong builder ecosystem, whereas both on Farcaster and on base more generally. Um, and then Solana seems more like, a gambling. I mean, there's obviously a ton of people building, but um, a larger percentage of the overall user base is just like sort of, you know, seemingly like degen gamblers slash traders. Not to say that like one is better or worse than the other. I think that's just sort of like the reality of the situation. And
yeah,
it's interesting within the, base world, as like sort of like Pump.Fun worked, and like there's tons of meme coins that have come out of it with, billion-dollar market caps and whatever. And um, I think Clanker is the best, has been the best like token launcher by market cap uh on base to date. And there were other attempts too, by the way. Like I think the form factor of
for sure.
tagging
There were
Clanker
there were
was,
a lot of attempts.
yeah, I played with like at least a few, and I think it was the form factor of being able to tag Clanker within Farcaster that probably was like sort of the biggest thing. And then obviously some of the early ones, working out, because there's been a long tail of other ones obviously that haven't had, significant market caps and whatnot. And um, I think like base is still, figuring out like what's our take on tokens. And while the early signs are that we value, we as in, base, values like, or Farcaster at least values, apps and wants the tokens that are, attributed to these apps. It's like, it's not like just because it seems more legit because like there's a real product attached to it doesn't mean it necessarily like is. Because at the end of the day, from my perspective, most of the value of the market cap of these early apps is still meme value. Like there's no um, prescribed path where the app doing well necessarily trickles into the coin. And this applies at like much larger levels too, with like some of the biggest, protocols or like, basically go through like the top 100 on coin market cap. Like sometimes there's more direct ties, but like oftentimes there's a very loose tie between what actually how the thing is generating revenue and the valuation of the associated token or
Yeah.
coin. And like you
like
look at
like like
Bitcoin.
ENS has like the first constitution item was like basically non-profit, and Uniswap has no protocol fee switch, or it hasn't been turned on, right? I
Right.
think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, so it's either
Uh,
speculative or just like kind of non-existent. And even in those cases where it is speculative or non-existent or whatever, the fees don't really like you would need insane growth to. I haven't looked at like numbers. I don't have like numbers off the top of my head to illustrate, but like generally, I think in a lot of cases you would need like outrageous growth to justify the money actually like going back to token holders at like something
right.
reasonably near the valuation. And so therefore, in my view, what's happening with crypto is people are saying you don't need that money to actually trickle back. You just need the attention. And the success of the app or the whatever it is, generically, regardless of like what revenue it's generating, like that will drive attention and the value the price of the coins will go up and down purely with attention without needing to ever sort of generate revenues and like send profits back to users in the way that like sort of stocks work. And so there's this sort of like meme premium. I mean, the most successful coin, obviously, Bitcoin. There's no semblance of any of that. It's just like Bitcoin is essentially a meme coin. It's just the first
Yeah, it
one,
is.
and
It is.
it's digital. Gold is basically a meme to some extent. Obviously, it can be used with jewelry and certain like industrial purposes, but they're belief systems. That's what That's what a meme is basically. And
I agree.
yeah, and so the fact that Bitcoin is number one on that, it's like I I've always wondered when you attach something real and tangible to it, something revenue generating to it, um, does that actually help the valuation, or does that potentially even limit the valuation because suddenly you have to justify it with like real revenues, real profits versus just having it be a pure meme? And so it'll be interesting as we see base like these apps are being valued, um, in some cases maybe based on like real upside that's expected for them, but in other cases they're kind of meme coins, you know, uh, posing as like app coins, I think, and like will base come to the same conclusion as Solana and say like actually it's just kind of it's meme coins all the way down anyway. I'm not really sure. But it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting. And so
Well,
this term that I think of
I
is,
agree with you.
yeah, I'll just say that the last thing is like this term that I sort of thought of that's like sort of a easy way to describe this concept I've been, thought about for a long time is like there's like sort of the revenue and, profit justified valuation of a given token based on the app and like what it's actually the money that it's generating. And that's like more along the lines of how you would value a stock or something. And then there's like what you could call a meme premium, or like the shorthand version could just be like a memeium. And that's like what that I think is the bulk of value for everything in crypto is a memeium. Whether it's a pure meme coin or a large percentage of the valuation being a memeium, I don't think there's very much within crypto that is sort of justified by the actual sort of fees generated by the thing, if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. I mean, I think you could take the same argument and take it to tech stocks, right? A lot of tech stocks are losing money or have very, very low sort of net income, so profit, and they're trading at like 200x sort of uh, net profit
Right.
or higher. So a lot of tech stocks, a lot of you know tech in general gets valued at like what will the value be in 20 years.
Yeah.
And like the reality is if crypto is the future of the internet and protocols have very strong network effects that are sort of moats, I think that is a reasonable position to take. Um, but I agree that a lot of the confusion is when there is something that's valued very highly, but the market sort of knows that the technology isn't there and that it's kind of a dead project. And there's a lot of that in crypto. So I do agree by adding some sort of like way of measuring the value of something, by having it have some sort of utility, then you muddy the sort of investment decision and you make it harder to justify. So I agree with that. I think the problem with pure meme coins is like it's kind of a narrative that very much benefits the sort of pump and dumpers of meme coins, of which I think there are many, many professionals on Solana. And I'm not convinced that like valuable, interesting apps get built as a result of that, right? So you do have these communities that get built up. But like if you look at the top meme coins, are these really robust long-term communities, or is there something else that's driving the price, right? And the other thing I think that I've been noticing to some degree is like there used to be this idea of like holding meme coins and it's sort of like the best ones would survive over time. I think to some degree, uh, it's becoming faster of like cycling through them. And in some part, I think this is a result of like that's the fastest, easiest way for influential insiders to make money. Um, it's way easier to make money through cycling through many meme coins in a couple days or weeks than it is like holding the same ones for years. Um, and so I think the way this sort of plays out is like, you know, more and more professionals, more and more manipulation of prices, more and more like retail as exit liquidity. And like I think this narrative of like pure meme coins, we'll see a pendulum swing back to where it'll go back in the other direction, maybe in 6 months or 12 months.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't really know how all of this is going to go. But my general sort of take is that I I think it like crypto might evolve uh in ways that are much less foreseeable and much less popularly agreed upon now than most people think. Um, because to your point, like this is the same similar sort of phenomenon is like happening with tech stocks. And it's very hard to reconcile, in my view, a world where you have like, a gas company or like a car company, I mean, I guess, not including Tesla, but like sort of a traditional company of some kind where like it's very, concretely valued. Take like a private company, just like a small company, like a car wash. Like you're valuing that based on the cash flows, and you're applying, a multiple of, whatever it is, 5 or 8, based on, the number of years that those cash flows would need to be generated. And then like the car wash can sell for that valuation because the buyer knows concretely, like, I'm going to make this money back in 5 to 8 years, and then the rest is gravy. And the seller is like, well, I'm willing to take 5 or 8 years worth of cash flow to part with this asset. And there's no like, meme coin or attention or anything like that touching that sort of thing. But then as you get further towards like tech stuff and internet native stuff, you have, to your point, like, Tesla and, whatever other tech company, Nvidia, like you have these stocks that are being valued no longer on cash flows or earnings, and like no longer really even on revenues. Like when the multiple on revenue gets so extreme that it's like not even really relevant, it's like, what is that actually being valued on? And I think there's an argument to be made that it's really just kind of being valued on, like, the business matters, like it's not totally irrelevant, but it's also just kind of like an attention thing, and like almost
I
like a
wouldn't say it's an attention thing. I think it's like the expected size of the market, right? Like almost all of these are based on like this market will rapidly grow. And I think that's in part why AI agents are getting a lot of the meme coin attention. Is like AI is like one of these markets where we sort of expect it to explode in size in sort of the non-crypto space and in the
Right.
crypto space. And that's in part why all the agents things are sort of doing well. Is like this is like the ultimate technology, right? It's AI is gonna eat every other technology company to some degree, right?
Yeah, I just think the looser, I don't disagree completely. I just think the looser that the tie gets to the actual business today, whether it's speculating on the size of the business in the future or the size of the market in which the business is operating in the future, or just like sort of the amount of attention, if you take one step further, that is going to be sort of captured by that entity or that market in the future, regardless of sort of what that is, as it gets further and further away from like real cash flows being like foreseeably, you know, tied to like each shareholder, it just gets more speculative and I just don't know how all this is going to play out. And I think that people, I think that, I don't know, it's part of the reasons that, I'm very active in crypto and whatnot is I think it's quite interesting and genuinely revolutionary. And it's just going to be interesting to see what happens with all of it. And then obviously you fold in the AI and everything like that. It's an interesting time. So I don't want it starts to get pretty conceptual and like high level, and I'm sort of like lost myself at this point. But I know we've gone quite a bit over time, so I appreciate the time. It's been a really interesting conversation, and anything that you want to sort of end on that you didn't get a chance to say, by all means. But other than that, excited to see what the future holds for Larry and for frames.fun or whatever, the ultimate app ends up being, and everything that you're building in the future.
Yeah, no, great conversation, Jake. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting things happening and that will happen in crypto and certainly in AI too. So I think it's a great time to be building and talking about these things.